Stochastic optimization is the tool through which economically viable decisions can be quantified and ultimately optimized. Here to discuss its importance and importantly how it works, Lokad founder Joannes Vermorel. So Joannes, I think most people have heard the terms optimization, or the term optimization many times from us in different contexts, and it's usually used in the same breath as probabilistic forecasting because ultimately those are the two key tools that we use. So before we get into all the mathematics of stochastic optimization, what is the executive level summary of both of these tools and why they're so important?
Probabilistic forecast is really about having a clear, quantified anticipation of the future. So if you want to optimize your supply chain, that's the problem, if you want to make your supply chain better somehow, you need to have some information about the future. So you need, and ideally, some quantified information. So probabilistic forecast is about knowing the future, but also knowing what you don't know, quantifying the uncertainty. So that's a part about understanding what lies ahead, so that you can take more informed decision. Now, so that's the first part. The second part is getting to the better decision. What does that mean? Better according to what? And here there is, I would say, optimization in a loose sense, which is just makes better. But there is also optimization in the mathematical sense. And in the mathematical sense, it would mean to find a solution to your problem that, according to a numerical criterion, gives you a loss that is smaller. I mean, or a score that is higher. But for the sake of this discussion, we'll probably stick to the loss perspective, where you want to just minimize the loss. So the optimization in this sense is a purely mathematical operation. It's about, for a given problem, finding the solution that minimize a loss function that you've given to yourself.
So for example, try not to lose too much money with the outcome of this decision.
So in the case of a supply chain, the basic decision would be, how many units do I order? And then for any quantity that I pick, there is an outcome where, with carrying costs, stock out penalties, obviously there is also the gains that I realize by selling stuff at a profit that would come as kind of a negative loss, so that you could minimize further by actually selling your products.
Okay, so I think most people will follow that. I mean, you're talking about constraints, but where's the stochasticity? I mean, you can optimize, but where's the stochasticity in what you just said?
So the stochasticity refers to classes of problems where we have an uncertain loss function, where the loss function is noisy. So if we go to this very classical inventory replenishment problem, I pick the quantity I want to reorder today, but whatever score or loss I get from this decision, I will only know later. And for now, I am just stuck with, I would say, uncertainty in what will be the final loss. And thus, when you have a situations where your loss function is fundamentally not known reliably in advance, you end up with a stochastic optimization problem, as opposed to classic deterministic optimization problems where everything is perfectly known. If we want to say do component placement, so you have you just want to fit different components inside, let's say, a box, taking into account all the physical dimensions of the various components. All of that is completely perfectly known. So this is a problem that has no uncertainty. It can be very difficult to find the complete combination, but there is no, unlike supply chain situations, there is no uncertainty there. Supply chain situations are, I would say, ultra-dominantly stochastic situations where there is some uncertainty, and the probabilistic forecast, it actually embeds this uncertainty. But the probabilistic forecast doesn't solve anything. It just tells you this is the future and this is the uncertainty. It doesn't. It's not a decision-making process or any kind of decision generation process either. This part is the optimization, and more specifically, a stochastic optimization.
And how does one sort of fine-tune that loss function then in light of all that stochasticity?
So the loss function is very straightforward. This is, at Lokad, we express that through economic drivers. So it is just about minimizing the dollars of error. So there is lot of I would say know-how that goes into fine-tuning this loss function to make it really adequate to the business so that it really reflects the dollars at stake. But fundamentally, we have two orthogonal concerns. One is finding a loss function that is completely faithful to the business strategy, but that doesn't require any kind of specific, I would say, numerical optimization skills. It is just about, do I have something that reflects my business? It only requires like the 4 operations, basic arithmetic operation. It's not something fancy. And the other one is whatever we need to do stochastic optimization for any given loss function.
Well, it occurs to me that when you do very good or very effective, or rather if you do effective probabilistic forecasting, couldn't you skip the optimization part entirely? Because if you knew better what you were going to do or what demand was going to be, why do you need to balance all of these other things? Couldn't you just order the amount that you've identified or the most probable return?
So if you had perfect knowledge about the future, then indeed the decision-making part is not that complicated. Although even in this sort of situations, you would have to deal with MOQs and flat ordering costs, flat transportation costs. You have even if you were to perfectly know the future, you would still be facing quite a few non-linearities where that prevents you from having like a trivial immediate solution. But in fact, the situation is much worse than that because you only have like a very imperfect knowledge about the future. And I think it's a completely unreasonable assessment to say we are going to ever get a forecast that eliminates the uncertainty. The uncertainty can be reduced, but it is to a large extent irreducible. I mean, there is a point at which it becomes just irreducible, and thus you're stuck with this uncertainty. And there is no, I would say, canonical decisions to be associated with the probabilistic forecast in the sense that there is no obvious solution. There is no evident solutions to be obtained.
Okay. Well, then circling back a little bit then to stochastic optimization, you talked about the ingredients. You listed the loss function. The loss function can't be the only ingredient that goes into stochastic optimization. So what is the breadth of ingredients required for this?
So when we approach mathematical optimization, there are 3 types of ingredients. The first are the variables. So the variables are essentially what you can pick. This is what defines your solution. Your solution is a specific combination of variables. So if you want to think of, let's say, a discrete problem such as finding the right combination for a padlock, you have, let's say, 4 variables. Each variable has 10 positions, and this defines, every combination defines a potential solution, and you want to find the one solution that click and open. So that's the first. The first ingredient are the variables. In supply chain, we are frequently referring to discrete problem because the variables are just integers. You can reorder 0 unit, 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, etc. But you can't really usually reorder 0.5. And the discrete aspect make it more difficult because you can't just easily go from one solution to another. You have a lot of severely non-linear patterns that happens that takes place. First, going from 0 to 1 unit is is very different as opposed to going just from, I would say, tiny fractions. But also you can have things like MOQs, minimal order quantity, where you have to jump 100, let's say, units ahead to even get to a solution.
But also constraint, no?
And that brings me to the second thing, which are the constraints. So typically you list the variables and you list the constraints. So the constraints are a set of mathematical expressions over the variables that tells you whether this is an acceptable, a feasible solution. So that would be, if we go back to a replenishment case, that would say we can reorder how many units we want, but there is a finite capacity for the shelf. So the shelf can only so there is like a max capacity for the shelf. There might be a max capacity for the day for how many goods can be processed by the store or ingested by the warehouse or by any other, I would say, location in your supply chain. And you have like tons of constraints like that. You can have a constraint that says, I need to have at least this, and that so that I can present a nice looking shelf. That would be a merchandising constraint in a store, etc., etc. So that's the console. We had the variables, we had the constraints, and the third one is the loss function. The loss function gives you, for any solution that is that satisfy all the constraints, here is your loss, and you want to just minimize. That's just a convention. And those three elements together defined, I would say, the general mathematical optimization framework. The reason why people, I would say mathematicians for the last 100 years have used this framework is that it's actually very, very general. And here we are even looking at a twist, the stochasticity, where we are adding, I would say, a fairly unusual twist to the problem, which is to say the loss function is not deterministic. It is not, I would say, a classic mathematical functions where you give an input and then you have a guaranteed output. We say you give an input and then you have like a randomized output.
It occurs to me, just to come back to the idea of you were listing constraints. And I mean, you can presumably, and correct me where I'm wrong, you could subdivide those constraints. So for example, you listed capacity. You know the capacity of your shelves, of your warehouse, how much can be processed in a day. Maybe that can be ramped up a little bit in terms of processing. But again, shelf capacity is finite, squared meters. That's not changing anytime soon. But MOQs could change. I mean, you could renegotiate. So there's a bit of fluidity here to some of these constraints. Is that the kind of stochasticity that you're talking about and that is factored into decisions?
So not really. I mean, the constraints are literally just a mathematical way to express the idea that some solutions are just not acceptable. Again, just like from when we are adopting, I would say, the optimization perspective, the loss function, the variable, the constraints, all of that are a given. So absolutely, just like there is a real deep question, but that's not a mathematical question of the adequacy of your loss function with regard to your business strategy. The same goes for your constraints. So you would say, well, is this constraint really a constraint? Can I actually invest to lift this constraint? Or can I just think differently about the business, etc.? So again, the idea is that you will have really two different perspectives. One is the modeling approach, where you say you really want to have variables, loss functions, constraints that are faithful with regards to your business. And that's fundamentally a non-mathematical, non-algorithmic undertaking. It's really about understanding whether those things are true to the business, but not true in the mathematical sense. There is a constraint is neither true or false in the mathematical sense. It just is. It's literally something where you say max capacity is 100 units. There is no mathematical validity in this statement. This is just a given. A mathematician can say, yeah, you pick 100. Mathematically speaking, I cannot tell you whether 100 is a good number. I can only tell you, for example, that if you tell me that there is a constraint that say it should be less than 100 units, and then another constraint that say it should be more than 100 units strictly, then I can tell you that there is no solution. You see, mathematics do not pass judgment on the sort of inputs that are given to them. It's just about having, I would say, internal consistency. So, but then the interesting things about that we have in the stochastic aspect, in the stochastic world, is that suddenly constraints becomes a lot more, I would say, subtle in a mathematical sense. So let's see what does it mean to have a stochastic problem. You see, in the old, I would say, non-stochastic optimization perspective, we had really a clear separation between this solution works or it doesn't, that due to constraints, not even taking the loss into account. But let's see what does that mean in a world where our loss function is stochastic. Let's say, for example, we have a warehouse and we can pass replenishment order. And we have an inbound daily capacity for the warehouse. So you see, every single day we have a limit on how many units we can process from the suppliers. And so what is usually done in this warehouse to take that into account is that we spread out the replenishment orders so that, take into account the lead times of the suppliers, so that we don't have all the suppliers delivering everything on the same day and going beyond the capacity, the daily capacity for the warehouse to receive the goods. That's good, but let's have a look at how it plays out from a stochastic optimization perspective. I choose my quantities, and then I have variability in the time for the deliveries. So that means that if I'm extremely unlucky, I might end up with a decision that is perfectly fine. Everything has been spread out in terms of replenishment orders, but my very early orders are late, and then my later orders are even in advance.
Yeah.
And by, I would say, a random flock, all of that end up collapsing on the same day, and then on this day I overload my my warehouse. I am beyond the nominal, reception capacity. And that's very interesting because you see there are plenty of situations where stochastic optimization problem where it is not possible anymore to have a solution that is perfectly feasible. So that means that you will live with situations where there is a probability that your constraints will not be enforced. And this is just the way, by the way, this is a mathematical statement that I'm making. I mean, due to the nature of the loss functions and the fact that your decisions may have consequences that are themselves non-deterministic, such as you decide and there is no uncertainty on that on the quantity, but then you don't have complete control on the day of delivery. And thus you can have, even if you've made the very best decisions, there is a possibility to have inventory quantities that collide. Or rather, the only way to make absolutely sure that it would never happen would be to make sure that in your entire pipeline of pending orders, for the entire pipeline, you never exceed what you could receive on any given day, taking into account the worst case scenario where all your pending orders would be delivered on the same day. This is insane. Obviously, this is way too extreme. Businesses have to deal with this sort of situation where, yes, there is one chance of 10,000, let's say out of 10,000, then I will exceed. I mean, but in reality, again, the idea of a constraints being like an absolute is more like a mathematical idea. In practice, if you exceed your capacity, there will be a cost. And that's the interesting thing is that when we go into the stochastic optimization perspective, we see that fundamentally constraints have, to a large extent, have to also become, I would say, part of the loss function. Otherwise, or approach in a way that says, I am okay with a certain degree of tolerance to accept that the constraints will be violated nevertheless with a low probability. Because for most of the interesting situations that are, I would say, stochastic optimization problems faced in supply chain, there will be, for any reasonable decision, there will be still a residual small probability that your constraints will be violated.
And when you talk about that tolerance, that's the feasibility that you're talking about, like and by extension, that's measured in.
So that measured in whatever capacity you've set for your problems. Again, if you say I want to replenish a store, well, you say it will. You take your decision so that it will fit your capacity, the capacity of the store. But what if the store, for some fluke, sell nothing on a given day? So let's say you want to, you're doing fresh food. You decide today to replenish milk, and you take, for some reason, you take this decision without having the sales of the day. But you still assume that some units will be sold. And if by a random fluke, you're on this store that normally on every single day sell 80% of its stock of fresh milk, due to a fluke, it sold nothing today, just pure fluke, then you might end up replenishing and going over your constraints. Again, there are plenty of ways to do that, but the key insight is that as soon as you are in a situation where there is uncertainty, not only your loss function varies, but also your satisfiability of the constraints, on whether you satisfy the constraints, it varies too. And for most of the interesting situations, you end up with my constraints will not be perfectly satisfied. And it would be a mistake to say, I only want to go for situations where I'm guaranteed that my constraints will be satisfied. Why? Because mathematically, you will get solutions, but they will be very poor. That will be solutions like, don't order anything, don't do anything. Just let, and you see, so that will give you, I would say, satisfaction in the sense no constraints violation, but it will certainly not give you like profit.
Yep. Well, again, because I do want to return to the example that you gave about receiving orders, staggering orders, and trying to do it in the most economically viable way. That would be, I guess, the stochastic approach. Well, the mathematical approach, or previous models that were based on, let's say, mathematical optimization, so lacking the stochastic dimension you're talking about, how did those in real time or in real life, how did those approach the problem that you just described? Again, lead times.
Just completely ignore the problem. It just do not even exist. In classical deterministic mathematical optimization, so non-stochastic, the varying consequences of your decisions are not even taken into account. They just don't exist. There are ways to, I would say, mitigate the case. One simple way would be to say, well, I macro expand the definition of my problem by saying, instead of looking at one optimization, I say I'm going to jointly optimize, let's say, 100 distinct scenarios. And I say that my decision has to be common for all possible futures, and I have to make sure that for all those varying scenarios, all my constraints are still satisfied. That's a very, so how do you go back to a deterministic case? Well, you can just say, I can copy my situation 100 times that represent 100 variants of the situation that would be at 100 trajectories, and then optimize the macro expanded problem that has 100 instances at once. And I can do that with a classical solver. But then it only make worse one problem that even already prevent today supply chain practitioners from using actually mathematical optimization tools in the first place. And this problem is scalability.
Okay. Well, I think it would be a good point, because again, a lot of theory has been now covered to actually start applying that to a specific vertical, so people can actually start to get a sort of a three-dimensional understanding of how the theory then interacts with real complexity, real constraints, real variables. So if you take, let's say, MRO, so in a company operating in the MRO space, typical size services a typical normal-sized fleet, let's say 10 planes, each of which has, I don't know, 250,000. We'll go low end, 250,000 parts. Make it easy. How would these three ingredients fit into a stochastic optimization for an MRO versus an old school mathematical one that doesn't work according to you?
So let's see what sort of problems we have. For an MRO, we want to optimize inventory so that you will be able to perform your repairs. And you have, let's say, a component that comes in, it is unserviceable, you start your repair, you discover the parts that you need, so you will have like a bill of material, but the bill of material is probabilistic, so it's uncertain. So there is a stochasticity that happens here, so you have the uncertainty of, will I get components to repair? That's fluctuating demand. But then once you get the component, you will actually discover what you actually need to repair the components. Now, and here you have the problem is that if one part is missing, you can't repair the component. So you see, it's not being able to have like 90% of the parts doesn't solve the problem. You're stuck. You need all the parts for the repairs, or you won't be able to repair the component at all. Now, if we look at the classical, I would say, so Lokad, we started years ago to do probabilistic forecasts for those situations. So probabilistic forecast is anticipate with the proper probabilities the arrival of components to be repaired. Anticipate the priority distributions of the parts that you will need. So that's going to be this probabilistic bill of material. And now we have to decide, what do we reorder? What are the parts that we want to have in stock and in which quantities? And then for those parts, there is also the uncertainty of lead times. And some of those parts are repairable. So some of them, there is an uncertainty that not only they will have their turnaround time, because you take out of your component a part, but this part itself is repairable, so you can have it repaired and put it back, or most likely you will take the parts, have this part repaired, but put another one into the component, because you don't want to wait till the part comes back to be repaired. But that means that when you want to decide if you need more parts, you have to take into account the parts that will be coming back, that are already in the process. So it's not just the parts that you have, it's also the parts that are coming back. And then the parts that are coming back, you have also other uncertainties such as scrap rates, where you try repair, but the repair may not work. And so you thought that you had like 10 parts that were coming back, but you only get 8 because 2 were scrap, because repair was not possible. Yeah. Okay, so that's a probabilistic forecast. That's all the uncertainties. Not all, there is plenty more.
Yeah, of course, there's a lot more.
But let's say that's a start. Now, you see the decisions, you want, ultimately, what you want is to assign to, let's say, if you want to do it naively, solve your part purchasing problems. So the question is that the MRO is facing is that, should I purchase for any part number 0, 1, 2, 3 more units of parts, taking into account all the parts that come back and everything. Now, the thing is, a part will have a value, economic value, if it contributes to a repair. So if it makes it possible to complete a repair. But just like the padlock that I mentioned earlier on, you have this click effect, where if you have all the parts, then click, you can repair, and all those parts have value. But if you're missing parts, all of that is just dead weight. You're spending money on inventories that serve no purpose. So there is the parts that you have only serve if you have the complete combination. If you have the combination minus stuff,
Then you have an AOG.
Then you have, yes, I mean, AOG was case, but you can have just delays for your clients. In any case, you see, the inventory only serves its purpose if you have everything. And if you don't have everything, then the question will be, how much time will it take to get, because you will discover at the last minute that something is missing, and how much time does it take for this something to become available if you pass an order very late for that. And so you see, the classic, if we are in the simple settings where where I have demand that is expressed unit by unit, completely independent. So all my SKUs are strictly independent, different clients, different everything. Then every unit I can, for every unit every stock position, I can compute a score, an economic score, and say, according to all the probabilities, I can compute the expected dollars of return of having this unit in stock. But for the MRO, I can't have this approach. Why? Because there is dependencies across part numbers. So you see, if I decide to purchase this one unit, then on its own, it may have no value. But if I purchase another unit, then I can complete a repair, and then both parts have a lot of value. So you see, it is until you have all the parts that you need for your probabilistic bill of material, the parts that you have are basically kind of useless. So their economic value is essentially when they are together. Apart, they have no value. So that means that whatever you use to do this stochastic optimization problem, you need to be able to investigate your decisions where you're not purchasing parts one by one or considering, parts that you have in isolation, but together. And the combinations of certain units to be acquired or can have a widely different value, economic value, compared to a standalone analysis where you just look at the parts one by one.
I'm going to try and field this thought and bear with me. But when you describe all of these stochastic elements, you're saying the part, let's say, the turnaround time to get that part, could be 1 day, could be half a day, could be 3 days, could be 4 days. There is another area of stochasticity which presumably is also people's ability to actually do the repair, like how long it takes a person once they've received the part, which varies.
Yes.
To actually say, for example, Joannes is repairing, I don't know, a Boeing, and it takes, ordinarily he can do 6 a day, but it takes a long time, so when he does 3 that day, and there's the knock-on effect. So can you account for that level of stochasticity, like the human-based stochasticity as well?
Yes, I mean, humans are just one sort of delays among the others, and they can have varying. You can even have some operators are more talented than others, and so, for example, they might even need fewer parts. Someone might manage to do repair consuming less stuff than a lesser talented employee that just throw away things where he or she does not succeed in doing the repair. You can, again, let's say if you're in an aviation MRO, components are highly modular, so components are made of components who are made of components. And so there is kind of always the option when you don't know how to repair to just throw away the entire submodule and just put a new one entire that is brand new in terms of replacement, as opposed to just identify the one thing that is failing and change only that. So you see, if you're very good in diagnosing what needs to be changed, you will change what needs to be changing. If you're less good, you might end up changing a lot more. But back to the case, the trick here is that when I define the solution, potentially we have to look at it from, and that's something that is a little bit orthogonal to the discussion, through the lenses of a policy. So that means that your solution is not necessarily just the decision that you take right now, but the general principle that guide your decisions. And so what exactly will you do as the solution unfold? So a policy might govern, let's say, you want to decide what parts you have in stock, but you will take into account how you react when you discover your probabilistic bill of material. And why does it matter? Let's say, for example, you want to repair an aircraft engine. There are some parts that are just at the exterior of the engine that they will be the first to be diagnosed. So as you receive your engine to do the repair, you will discover what you need for the exterior of the engine, just because as you dismount the engine, that will be the first part that you touch. And thus, you will have, and basically an engine is just like a matryoshka. It's plenty of layers that goes to the core. And so if you discover a part that is on the exterior of the engine, then you will most likely have a lot of time to source this part, because you will first have potentially many days to dismount the aircraft engine to the core, and then gradually remount from the core outward the engine. And you will need the part that fits at the exterior of the engine at the very end of the process. And so if on the day one you discover that you need a part, but then it needs like, let's say, 60 days to dismount everything, remount everything, and then plug the parts, then you can say, well, this part I don't even need in stock, because I discover by the time I get to need the parts, I can on day one reorder the parts, and on day 60, when I actually need the parts, I have the parts readily available, because my lead time from my suppliers was just, let's say, 20 days. So you need, when you want to look at your inventory at your inventory optimization for parts, you need to take into account, and that's the policy, which is what parts do I need to have readily available, and what will be my typical reaction to when I face the discovery of this probabilistic bill of material. If I assume a different policy, such as the person doing the dismounting of the aircraft has no information at all about the stock availability or unavailability of parts, then it's a completely different story, because then I dismount the aircraft engine, remount the aircraft engine, and then 60 days afterward, I still discover that I'm out of stock for this one part that is missing. So you see, the policy would express this sort of sequential decision-making situations where what sort of decisions will take place and how it will shape the final economic outcome of the situation as it unfolds. So you see, the idea, we have two policies here. One is smart. I react as early as I have the information, I pass the purchase order, versus I wait until I have to mount the part, and then I realize that the part is needed, and then I pass the order. If you're in the situation where the policy is the second one, then that means that it will put a lot more economic value on having the parts in stock, because it's the only way to make sure that we don't delay the aircraft engine further at the very end because this one part is missing. If the first policy, the smart one, is in place, then it means that there is no economic value in having those parts at the exterior of the engine in stock, because due to the policy, I will not be missing them, because the purchase orders will be passed only early. Sorry.
What kind of even just technological overheads would be associated with the kind of reactivity, like the computational reactivity that you're describing? So again, engine, I work my way in and I discover, I need that part. That completely reconfigures the entire projected timeline of this repair.
So that's a very interesting question. Scalability has been a major concern. When I say scalability, I mean scalability of mathematical optimization techniques for supply chain has been like a showstopper for essentially 4 decades. So mathematical, what is interesting is that mathematical optimization is supposedly a super established field of research, and there are super established software players that sell what is known as solvers. Solvers are software designed to address mathematical optimization problems, and they typically comes with their own programming language. So it's typically mathematical programming languages that let you express your variable, your loss functions, and your constraints. And the interesting thing is that although it has been 4 decades since those solvers have been introduced to the market, there is even open source solvers nowadays, and yet those solvers are nowhere to be seen in supply chain. And I believe that scalability is a big problem. I mean, if we decompose the sort of techniques that are available on the market, we have essentially the nicely behaved loss function, the convex functions. So convex functions means that your functions look like this. It has like a gentle curve, and you can, when you pick a solution, you can gently roll to the bottom. You just have to follow the gradient, and you will get to the bottom. And so those nicely behaved will be linear functions, quadratic functions, this sort of functions. Here, we don't have any scalability problems. We can have like literally billions of variables. But those the problems we face in supply chain are not nicely behaved like that. Then we have, I would say, a second class of solvers who are, or I would say of techniques, which are branch and bounds, branch and cuts, which essentially assume that the constraints predominates, that you have very, very few valid feasible solutions. So that you have so many constraints that you can eliminate entire, I would say, hyperplane of your space of solutions. So essentially, you can slice your set of solution in half and say, this half I just throw away because I know that all those solutions will not ever satisfy the constraints that I have. And literally, you can throw away half of the solutions and repeat the process of eliminating half of the solutions a large number of times. And then at the end, you end up with a very small space, and then you can investigate this small space quite extensively. So that's I would say, the classical solver. And there is a lot of techniques of what is called relaxation of the problems, which is you look at the problem without the constraints, you find the ideal solutions without the constraints, and then you reapply the constraints, etc., etc. Those problems, they again, if you don't have like super tight constraints, they scale very, very poorly. So you see, the scalability of those techniques very much depends on how much leeway you still have once all the variables are, all the constraints are applied. And that's the problem, is that in supply chain, the sort of problems that we consider, there is a lot of constraints, but they are not super tight. Think about the padlock. The padlock is, you have 10,000 combinations, there is only one that does click. All the others, it's just wrong. Well, in supply chains, you have constraints, but those constraints are not like super tough. For example, within the constraints of the shell capacity, you still have a huge amount of solution. You can decide to put more of these products, more of these products. There is when you look at it, it's a very weak constraint. It's not the sort of constraints that reduce your solution space to a few solutions. You still have like an absolutely enormous amount of solution. So that's and just to get the sort of sense, those all those solvers that approach, those, I would say, solution space elimination sort of techniques, branch and cuts, branch and bound, etc., etc. Beyond, I would say, 1,000 variables, they typically perform extremely poorly. Maybe, I mean, if you go crazy, 10,000 variables, but that's already, pushing it to the extreme limits. We are talking of very big machines with gigabytes of RAM, tenth of gigabytes of RAM, tenth of CPUs, and potentially hours to get a resolution. So it's going to be super slow, and 10,000 variables, you would say, oh, that's already a lot. Not quite. It's tiny. Just consider that, let's say, a mini market, just a mini market, it's going to be 5,000 products. But then, so that's minimum 5,000 variables. But then it's not 5,000 variables, because the question is really, do I bring 0 unit, 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 units? So let's say you stop at 10. 10 is going to be enough. But I'm already at 50,000 variables.
And then the locations.
And per mini market. And
Yep,
obviously,
exactly.
if you have like mini markets. So you see, even like a toy problem, like a mini market, is already like at 50,000 variables, and that's way beyond what you can do. And then we have like a third class of tools, which are local search. Local search is another class of techniques that say, let's assume that you can find a feasible solution. In the case of supply chain, it is a very reasonable assumption. So finding a solution that clicks, that does not violate any constraint, is typically fairly easy. You know, if I say, for example, your constraint is you should not overflow this shelf, well, just order less. You know, it's not something, just decrement your units until you satisfy the constraint. It's not like super hard. If you have like a minimal order quantity, well, if you want to satisfy the constraint, you just add +1 to a product until you have the quantity. So it's not difficult to find a solution that satisfies the constraints. It's not like, again, a cryptographic puzzle where you need to get dozens of variables exactly right so that it fit. No. In supply chain, usually when I say problems are easy, is that usually by adjusting just one variable, you can get the solution to click. So you can just diminish a quantity until it fits in the shelf, diminish, or increase the quantity until you have like this MOQ, same thing like that. So it's just, you have like semi-trivial ways to get a solution that satisfies your constraints, but I'm not saying anything about the quality of the solution. I'm just saying that you will find a solution. And essentially, local search just say, once you have a solution that fits, you can mutate randomly this solution. And then if the mutated solution, so you just change, a variable, you just increment, decrement, change it a little bit, different ways to do that. And if the solution, the new solution violates one of the constraints, and you get rid of it. And if it still satisfies the problem, and you have a loss function that tells you that the loss function tells you that this solution is better, then you jump to this solution that is better, and you keep iterating. So loss function means that you have already a solution that is legal in a sense. You randomly modify that, and when out of luck, you get a solution that, according to your loss function, is better, and that the solution satisfies your constraints, then you jump to this new solution and rinse and repeat. There are tons of variants of, I would say, they are called typically meta-heuristics, genetic algorithms, taboo search, and whatnot. And all of that are on the premise that you start with a solution, and you just iterate over a solution with random mutations. That gives you, I would say, more scalability. You would be able to, with this sort of techniques, to go to maybe a million variables, but it is still very, very sluggish, and at Lokad we have tried, and it still do not pass the test of scalability for supply chain. So it's out of the classical way, it's the better, but it is still too weak to scale to the sort of problems where we have very rapidly millions of variables, and we want to have like fast convergence, and we want also, I've not even started to discuss the stochasticity aspect of the problem, because you see, when I was mentioning this problem for these mini markets where we had 50,000 variables, so 5,000 products, 10 inventory position. But then if we macro expand, with 100 trajectories, just like I described, to take into account the possible futures, then we are at 5 million variables. Yeah. You see, so it rapidly inflates, and again, it's just not enough. Just not enough.
Well, again, so I don't want to misrepresent, because that was quite a lot, and I do want to circle back to the original question, and I want to append it a little bit, because if I could summarize up to this point, the problem with the older mathematical optimizations was it was deterministic. Things are known. There's a right and a wrong, basically. You can make a right decision or a wrong decision. And then I asked you, in the example of MRO complexity, and I recall you didn't even list all the complexity. You have a full lecture on this. And you gave a very clear insight into just how complex it was. And I asked you, what are the technological overheads for the stochastic optimization of the small, like the microcosmic glimpse of complexity that you gave? And obviously it's insane. What I'm asking actually is not what is the perfect way to implement this. What is a better way to use stochastic optimization? It might not be perfect, but what's a functional or a feasible way to implement it that doesn't violate everything that you just said?
So the gist is mathematical optimization is really a problem of, do you have something that truly scales? Because you can get back to a deterministic problem. So you have a stochastic problem. You can cheat and re-express that as a deterministic one by macro expanding your problem with those 100 trajectories that I expressed. The problem is that we started with mathematical optimization technique that already suffered from severe scalability problem. And now we say we are going to inflate the problem, the definition of the problem, to kind of re-express the stochastic problem as a deterministic one, except that it makes your scalability problem even worse. Same thing for the loss function that varies. There is a trivial way to deal with stochastic optimization, just the way you would do it with a deterministic solver. You just say, just execute my loss function that varies 1,000,000 times and average out the outcome. That would work, except that the computational overhead is just gigantic. So you see, the point that I'm making, at the core, we have a problem where those mathematical optimization tools have been available for decades, but they don't scale. And they don't even handle stochasticity. So you see, even before considering stochasticity, which results from those probabilistic forecasts, they were already not scalable enough. If you pile up stochasticity, then we are, I would say, orders of magnitude. And that's why Lokad had to essentially redevelop an entire class of technology for stochastic optimization, so that we have something that can do
what we're talking about.
Can address those stochastic optimization problems at a scale that makes sense for supply chain. And if I go back to why do we really want that, the answer is that when Lokad introduced probabilistic forecasts back in 2012, we very quickly realized that we had a big problem. Optimizing under uncertainty is very, very difficult. And for years, we crafted, let's say, smart heuristics to kind of duct tape the situation. So you can get away with smart heuristics. So heuristic just means like a clever way that will just work somehow in these very specific settings. So you're cheating. You find a cheat that kind of work in a narrow situations. But the issue with that is that those heuristics tend to be fragile, and then when you introduce cross cross-product constraints or cross-skew constraints or anything where you have like interdependent thingies in your supply chain, can be anything, then those heuristics tend to fall apart. And that's why you need to have a stochastic optimization. If you don't, well, what does that mean for businesses? It means that you rely on typically very conservative human judgment. It kind of works, but the problem is that you tend to play it super safe to satisfy your constraints. And that's the problem, is that in supply chain, all the problems can be solved by just throwing more money at the case. You see, if I go back to my aviation MRO, well, there is the obvious solution. Just say, sky's the limit. I can have how many parts I want. So I'm going to have like a ton of inventory, and then I will have good service level. Okay, if you just throw money at the problem, yes, you will kind of solve the problem. But you see, this is not like a tight resolution. This is a very loose resolution. Same thing for the shelf limit. If you can have, you can decide that you partition your store with tons of very narrow constraints. Say those 2 products or 3 products should not have this much space, and this one no more than this much space, so that limit the sort of variation of internal composition that your store may undergo. If I say yogurts, all yogurts combined, there should be no more than 200 units. Fine. But what if this constraint is wrong? What if there is like a surge in locally, and this constraint for the total amount of yogurts is way too low, and so you end up at the end of every Saturday there is not a single yogurt left in your mini market. So you see, what happens is that when you do not have a stochastic optimizer, a stochastic solver available, what businesses do is that they typically tend to add a lot of constraints to reduce the solution space. So that the people, or potentially the software that are going to pick the solutions, make decisions, operate in a solution space that is much more narrow, and so that alleviate all those sort of cross-skew dependencies, cross-skew concerns, and but that cheating in the sense that there might be much better solutions that are out there, and you've just a priori eliminated those solutions by just piling up tons of fake constraints.
All right. Well, Joannes, we've covered a lot there. So in terms of trying to summarize or collapse a lot of this to make it, again, more appreciable to people who necessarily might not have a mathematical training, stochastic optimization is a much more flexible and reactive way of optimizing decisions compared to the traditional or classic mathematical optimization. Yes, no?
So yes, it is a more expressive way. You see, so whatever you can express as a deterministic problem, you can also express as a stochastic problem. But in a way, stochastic is much more general. And this, because you see, deterministic just means that your function doesn't vary at all. So if you have a function that varies, you can always pick a function that do not vary. It will still work, if you have, and so the framework is define what class of problem you can approach. If your problems involve uncertainty, you need stochastic optimization. That's literally the class of problems your situation belongs to. And now, ideally, you want a software component to address that. And as we say, probabilistic forecast is the sort, and all the sort of tooling that let you generate those probabilistic forecasts, that's about assessing the uncertainty. Now, when it comes to the decision making itself, we need a component as well. And the typical perspective for mathematical optimization is to have a solver. A solver is a generic piece of software that can take essentially any problem statement, so loss function, variables, constraints, but loss function deterministic, and give you the solution, so a combination of variables, of values for the variable that minimize. And you can have the exact same thing, a solver, but it's going to be a stochastic solver. And so it will give you as an output the combination of variables that you seek. And why do you want to have a solver? Well, your loss function that represents your dollars of gains and losses, they are up to change. Maybe you want to retweak this function over and over and over, but you don't want every single time you touch your loss function, so you adapt your strategic vision, you don't want to re-implement a full software resolution of the numerical recipe that will give you a solution. You just want to say, here is a new loss function, just reapply the resolution to this updated loss function. And that's what a solver can do for you. It's like the packaged software component that will take the definition of a loss function, definition of constraints, and definition of variables, and give you the solution.
So the software tool that you're talking about, the solver software tool, that automatically regenerates the optimization or the solution that you're talking about. Well, that then reduces the amount of work that, let's say, a traditional supply chain practitioner would have to do.
Exactly. That would, in practice, this would entirely automate the decision generating, the decision-making process. You see, the solver is what, at the end of the day, generate the final decisions that are proposed by Lokad to its clients. Again, there are different ways to approach the optimization. You can have it with heuristics. Some of them are very good. There are certain situations where heuristical solutions work very, very nicely. So you don't necessarily need the solver. You just have your heuristic that plays a role of a solver. And you have situations where you actually use the solver. But the bottom line is that, yes, this is the thing that, given the forecast, generates the solution.
And again, just for the clarification of anyone who's watching, when you use solver, do you use that interchangeably with numerical recipe that generates the recommended decisions, for example, in an inventory replenishment?
So, I mean, when I use the term numerical recipe, I'm usually referring to the entire chain of processing. It's more like everything from the raw data till the generation of the results. And here, this numerical recipe is typically decomposed into a series of stages: preparation of the data, generation of the forecast, and then optimization, and then typically presentation of the results. So you see that's different stages. And here today we are only discussing about the computation of the final decision, which are taking the forecast as input.
Well, then if the supply chain practitioner disagrees with the generated supply chain decision as provided by the solver, what's the recourse there? Because again, if it's taking into consideration millions of variables operating on a scale of thought that is way beyond human capacity, then how can you, as a supply chain practitioner, evaluate the rightness, wrongness, suitability?
I mean, first, that's the beauty. A solver is very straightforward to challenge. You can just say, here is my better solution. Let's challenge this solution against a loss function. You see, all it takes to prove that your solver is crap is to show a solution that is better than the one that has been found by the solver. So you see, the solver gives you a combination, and typically, once you've given a solution, assessing, the loss function is there, the constraints are there. So here is the tentative solution. Let's first check that the constraints are validated. Okay, check, they are. And now let's apply the loss function that give me, the loss in dollars. Okay, this is the loss. And this is the solution presented to me by the solver. Now, if I manually tweak this solution, I just need, to cherry pick my variables, and I end up with something that is better than the loss function. Then I have proven that I am able, as a human, to generate a solution that is superior to the solver. And in this case, well, the solver is not very good. And that can very much happen. By the way, this is a problem when I was talking about scalability. It's not that those off-the-shelf solvers that you would find in the market would not find solutions. They will find solutions. They would just find very crappy solution. And when I say crappy solution where supply chain practitioners would manually retweak the quantities to be purchased, and it will still satisfy all the constraints, and according to the loss function, it would be better. So you see, challenging it's in a way, challenging a solver is much easier than, let's say, challenging a probabilistic forecasting model. All you have is to exhibit a solution that happens to be better according to the loss function. And if you have like special insights in the problem, you can you can maybe craft manually something that again outperform your solver. For most of the software, I would say all the software, all the commercially available solvers in supply chain settings, it is fairly straightforward to manually outperform them. Again, they are really not that good when it comes to stochastic problems. So their scalability is terrible. So you will have to, again, when I say a solver, I don't mean a solver that you run for like 6 months. I mean a solver that you run for, let's say, 30 minutes and be done with it. If again, we have to take into account that we can't give an unlimited amount of time to the solver to complete. So we have to say, this amount of time, let's see what we have. And if the solution after 30 minutes is complete crap, then it's not that difficult frequently for a human to just do better.
All right. Well, what would you say is the key takeaway then for people having listened to this?
So the key takeaway is that stochastic optimization is a very important angle that is mostly absent from supply chain textbooks. You don't talk about it. It's not even present. Most authors don't even acknowledge that the problem exists in the first place. The very large, very established players who are selling solvers are selling solvers for deterministic optimization problem. Those are good solvers, don't get me wrong, but they are not solving the class of problems that we have in supply chain due to this uncertainty. They just ignore the uncertainty. And then, what are the upside of having such a solver? It lets you improve your supply chain in ways that truly look at all the interdependencies that exist. That look, instead of looking at things in isolation, they look at your supply chain as a system where everything contributes to the system, and you need to look at those dependencies. Those dependencies can take many forms. In aviation, that's the list of parts that you need to do a repair. But if you're in fashion, that will be, for example, the fact that a store, to be very appealing, need to have garments of all the colors. Otherwise, if you just have like brown and gray, it's sad. So you need to have like a large diversity of colors. That's something that you cannot express at the product level. You need to have a look. If you're in an hypermarket, you need to think of what is the actual shopping carts, shopping list that people want. They don't come to an hypermarket to buy one stuff. They want a whole list of stuff. Maybe they want to cook recipes. So you need to have all the stuff that, and again, that's, and for pretty much all the supply chains, non-trivial supply chain, you have interdependencies all over the place, and unless you have a stochastic solver or a stochastic resolution technique, you cannot even approach the problem in a satisfying way.
Well, Joannes, thank you very much for your time. I don't have any further questions. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.